Good afternoon, folks. It's your old pal Colby Evans here, coming with you in another episode of the ARCA Racing Podcast, the classic version. Today we're reviewing the 2008 season finale cluster F of a race from the Toledo Speedway, the 2008 Hance Group 200. As of course, my name is Colby Evans. Welcome to the show. Follow me at Start and Park Car. Follow Brad Smith on Twitter. Follow ARCA Racing on Twitter, and follow Brock Beer on Twitter. You guys know how it goes. But anyway, let's get right into the race. The 2008 championship season finale for the ARCA Remix series at the time. We discussed it in last week's ARCA race. They came in just separated by 90 points. But of course, we know back then in that year's point system, every spot was worth, I think, 5 points at the time, and winning a race was like 180 points. The points differences were way different than they were back in the day. So mathematically, Ricky Stenhouse Jr., Justin Allgaier, and even Frank Kimmel were mathematically still in line for this championship hunt. But coming into today, all Scott Speed had to do was just finish 19th to clinch the championship. We had it in a huge, astounding field, and boy, those were the days. 43 cars attempted this race. But on a little short track like Toledo, you just can't start 43 cars. You could try, but they'll catch the back of the field in literally 3 or 4 laps. So they capped the field off at 35, which I believe still holds up today, as they believe they cap them at the 35-car fields. But needless to say, we were going to have a lot of Dnqs. And the Dnqs that usually would pop up here are kind of the start and parks and slower cars like the Hilton team, the Peterson team, the start and park team for Norm Benning, the 8-car, Mike Harmon, and kind of like those guys who, although they've been running most of the season, just hadn't acquired enough provisionals that some of the other teams had needed to make this race. Everybody practiced. Not shockingly, the Red Bull entry was the fastest car in practice, with the slowest being Greg Sievers, and of course in the Benning entry, being almost a whopping almost 3.5 seconds slower than the leaders, which is pretty astounding, considering how do you go 3.5 seconds slower on a half-mile short track. But that's just because those cars were so old at the time, and Norm was just barely scraping by. It was the last year of his full-time ARCA team, if you guys didn't know, for any Norm Benning fans out there. This was the last full-time year of his ARCA team. In 2009, he would go to trucks, and his ARCA team would basically do start and parks most of the season. Most of the season, not full-time, just to bring a little extra money. But like I said, we were only going to start 35. And surprisingly enough, a lot of the slower guys, maybe not shockingly, didn't take a lap in qualifying, which I don't really know why. Maybe because they just didn't think, we don't have the speed. Maybe we don't have enough provisionals. But it does show here that only 38 of our 43 entries actually took a lap in qualifying. The cars that did not were the 24 of Mike Harmon, the 8 of Greg Sievers, the 06 of Tim Mitchell, the 48 of Marcus Fox, F-U-X. I probably didn't say that right, but I hope I did. And the 7 of Mark Dimitrioff. I believe that's how you pronounce it. Neither of those guys took a lap in qualifying. The slowest was Nur Ali. And if anyone remembers Nur Ali, just search him up on YouTube, and you will find the famous video of him, 2012 Fall, Kansas, wrecking the car in practice and absolutely just ranting in that interview. I will never forget that. My personal favorite memory of Nur was at Phoenix a couple races later in the 70 entry for Rick Ware. Was so slow in that car, they took him out, and I think they put Timmy Hill in that car, and Timmy ended up running that race. And that was the last we ever saw of Nur, I believe, in NASCAR. But he ran this ARCA race and ungodly was slow. I mean, and this was a Cunningham Motorsports driver development car. It was listed under Mark Gibson Racing, but I got to believe that, judging by the paint scheme, that this was actually a Cunningham Motorsports development car. This car most of the season had been run by Michael Phelps, not the Olympic medalist. just another guy who happened to be named Michael Phelps. But for some reason, Nur was running this race, and obviously they made the race on provisionals, but it was very weird what they did in the race, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But we had those guys fail to qualify, and Justin Lofton would end up winning the pole, and it looked to be a great weekend for the Eddie Sharp team, but as we will come to find out, it wasn't. Our championship contenders had qualified. Scott Speed was the best in third. Stenhouse was fourth. Allgaier was ninth, and Frank was down in 13th. Really showed back in 2008 that you had a lot of good cars in the ARCA series. You know, I mean, the mid-pack field for ARCA was highly, highly competitive. So after restructuring, unfortunately, in ARCA, the top 28 for this race were locked in on speed, and everybody else got provisionals. And so sadly, that would mean that our Dnqs for this race overall would be Jake Francis for the Stan Hoover team, Kurt Torrey, Larry Hollenbeck, and then, of course, the others I previously mentioned, Harmon, Sievers, Mitchell, Fox, and Dimitrioff. Unfortunately, none of those people were able to make the show. The quickest of those bunch was Jake Francis, who qualified 32nd, but of course he had to be in the top 28 to make the race. Our provisional starters being I can read this right. Oh, yeah. Nur Ali, who got the 29th provisional. Daryl Basham, Norm Benning, good buddy Brad Smith, Phil Basel, Ali Owens, and Michael Simcoe were our last starters who got the provisionals. Wish they would have just took the fastest 35 then, but obviously ARCA still does that today, and that's just how they do their own rule book. Can't blame them for that. Race started out as you would expect it. A lot of people just expected Scott Speed to have a very, very solid race. Maybe not really run hard for a win, but just kind of hover around the top 10 and just collect a decent finish. That was kind of the plan in the pre-race interview. Obviously, if the win was there, try to win the race, but overall plan was to just kind of make sure we're not in line to lose the championship. Problem was you had a really aggressive and a really hungry Ricky Stenhouse Jr. behind him. And rewatching this race, I'd seen this race about 5 times, and it still pisses me off every single time seeing how aggressive Ricky Stenhouse Jr. was with this poor guy for the first 30 laps. Stenhouse was all over the bumper of Speed, bumping him, even moving him out of the way at one point. And God, I was wondering though why, still rewatching this race, why Scott just didn't let him go. Even if Stenhouse had gotten to the lead, he was still 75 points behind. So it does make me wonder why he didn't just let him go. But they had an early caution, and unfortunately, the second place driver, Dexter Bean, was actually turned around by Scott Speed, and unfortunately was not given a spot back, which was kind of stupid. I feel like if you ever accidentally get spun out under caution, you should get your spot back. If it's in just a pure accident, that's nothing. You can't help that. You can't help that. One of the weirder moments of this in the early laps was the backmarkers, Norm Benning. They were flying around Norm Benning going into turn 3, and Norm just flew it into turn 3 and just about took out the leader, Justin Lofton, which was hilarious. Just about took out the damn leader, killed Lofton's left side. It was utterly hilarious. Norm's car is just beat to shreds because he's used that. If you watch that race, that white Chevrolet that Norm was using, he had used that car pretty much in every race this season. That car was beat up. But starting with the beginning of the race, Nur Ali, as I mentioned earlier, ran exactly 1 lap with handling issues. Now, was this a planned start and park? I have to believe so. Because he was so slow that it would have been utterly unsafe for him to be out there. Now, Brad Smith was also really slow. He was the second slowest car to take a lap in qualifying, but Nur was still almost a second slower than Brad Smith. Almost a second slower than Brad Smith. It's possible that they just really did tell Nur and the 45 team, hey, one lap and you're done. Now, I don't know the full story with that team, but it still confuses me to this day why a Cunningham-prepared car would run just one lap. I mean, we all know was not a good driver, but was he really that bad where they couldn't even trust him to run a couple of laps? Really just ran one lap. And it didn't appear that with the other ARCA start and park cars not making the field, that there was not going to be really more. Everyone else is going to try to run the full race. So going back up to our second incident that involved poor Dexter Bean again, we had seen the 99 and the 2 make even more contact. And it was starting to get a little concerning. You know, they were really bumping and banging off of each other. Poor Dexter Bean, like I said, I always felt like that Team Glock entry with the Jeff Spraker team was very good. They just never had the right luck. And unfortunately, this was Dexter's last ride for that team. He would go on to form the short-lived 51 team next year, which didn't do all that successful. But Dexter had a rough time in this race, again, getting wrecked. They never said on the broadcast who actually would wreck him. They implied that he just wrecked himself, when if you look on the replay, he clearly did get wrecked. Also, shout out real quick to that 23 team of Donnie Kelly. Got 4 straight lucky dogs. That was kind of funny. 4 straight lucky dogs. 5 laps later, the 12 of Allie Owens would wreck. And it was at that time where we saw even more contact, and you just had to feel like it was coming. You know, it was very early in the race, but it was going to come where he was going to wreck him. And sure enough, not just 2 laps after that restart, the 99 full sends, doesn't even brake, full sends that 2 car into the wall. You cannot tell me otherwise that Stenhouse blatantly wrecked that 2 car. I know some people have some different opinions over the years, but from rewatching that race, I don't even remember it being that blatant. But it looked to me that Stenhouse just blatantly dumped that 2 car going into 3. And, you know, even in 2008 at the short tracks, they didn't have safer barriers. And Toledo's walls were not even. So hitting the wall did a lot of damage, and it did. The track bar was shifted. The rear of the car was shifted over to the right. It was killed. Let's just say it was killed. Drivable, but killed. And they were able to get the car to pit road. They got the tires changed. Did catch back up with the field, but going back to the restart, you could kind of see the way he was weaving his car back and forth. It didn't look good. And they took the green flag, and he had trouble even keeping up with guys like Darrell Basham and Brad Smith. He physically just could not keep up. And I think that was only because it was his first couple of laps. You know, you don't want to push it because you don't want to over push and then wreck it again. I think he was just trying to get some test laps in. But unfortunately, with how small Toledo is, he was going so slow, they had already caught him in just 2 or 3 laps. They had caught him. And I honestly wished it would have been like another 5 before they caught him, because I feel like he could have picked up his pace. But we'll get to that little note I have in a second. And he would pull his famous move. They started lapping him and going into 1, full sends into the 99, smashes into the wall. 99 smashes into the wall. The 2 breaks the pit wall. And the famous scene of the 2 championship contenders in ARCA acting like complete knuckleheads. And just, wow. You know, even the announcers, you can hear the shock in Phil and Rick Allen's voice. They're like, wow, I honestly cannot believe this is happening. Neither could the audience at home, and I bet even watching the race today, nobody really can get why. Scott Speed, of course, was parked. They didn't actually park the car. They just parked the driver. So it's possible that they could have gotten another driver in that car. But the only one out of the race other than that was Nur Allen. I don't really think you want Nur Allen in a Red Bull car. Stenhouse, one of the weirder wrecks I've seen, Stenhouse got stuck on the wall. The car didn't look totaled, and he probably could have driven it back to the garage and saved himself about 10 laps or 15 laps. But they got stuck, literally stuck on the wall. Now, they interviewed Scott Speed, and I respect his interview. You know, obviously he was very, very frustrated, but you gotta be real, man. You can't just do that. And if you're gonna do that, do it later in the race, you know. But the one thing I really noticed about his car is that, yeah, it couldn't keep up, but it didn't look like that car, as damaged as it was, it didn't look like it was gonna break early. It looked like that car, had they kept working on it, maybe bending out some sheet metal, and just during all the cautions, jacking up the car and looking at the undercarriage and trying to make any adjustments they could, that car was drivable. And I'll fast forward to the end real quick. We only had just 23 cars finish this race. They said that even with Stenhouse winning, all Scott Speed had to do was finish like 19th or better. With how far back Justin Allgaier was, the likelihood is that even if they could have got this car fixed, he probably at one point still could have been faster than Brad Smith and Norm Benning, and it is possible they also could have gotten them to move out of the way for Scott to get him a couple extra positions. Based on the finishing results of this race, it's likely that Scott would have finished still around 17th to 20th, and I still think could have won the championship. I think if he had not done what he did and simply tried to ride it out, I think Scott Speed would have still won the championship that year by the smallest of margins. But we'll never know. That's just my personal observation. But needless to say, Scott Speed was not happy about the crash. And the biggest line from his interview was, he ain't going to win the championship doing stuff like that. Fair point. I mean, Stenhouse should not have done what he did, but neither should have Scott. And I'm kind of surprised they didn't park the 99 either. They actually did come back out in the race. Stenhouse would finish the race 69 laps down. But yeah, it didn't really matter them getting the car back out there. Excuse me, guys. I'm trying to look up something real quick. But it was very blatant. It didn't. The good news is it didn't take anyone out in the wreck also. The 32, as you guys saw, was involved, but it didn't get any severe damage. So the race kind of kept going after that. But it was definitely weird seeing the two championship contenders just 35 laps in, both now in the garage. The race resumes. We still have the other Eddie Sharp car out front with Justin Lofton, but two really weird people that you really would not have expected to see running second and third. Brandon Thomason and Michael Simcoe were running second and third, and I'm like, that is awesome. Now, I believe that was a Cunningham car, but Michael Simcoe is one of those guys where he never had the best equipment, but if he could get up there, he could challenge. Unfortunately, the luck would not pair out for him better in this race, but we'll get to that in a second. But it was quite funny seeing that unsponsored car and a guy like Michael Simcoe, who had never really had the best success in his career, for it to come down, for him to run that good was very shocking. Cautions galore in this race. Just 3 laps later, we had our old buddy Brad Smith, who in 2008, side note, was still driving a Taurus in 2008. He had not had enough money to switch to a Fusion body, was still running a Taurus body in 2008. That's why we love him so much, folks. He had gotten into Bobby Gerhardt, which created another caution. Just cautions galore in this race. You know, some people just doing this race on one set of tires, and I don't blame them. We were able to run 12 laps, and it just seems like every time they would get around the back markers, the back markers had a lot of trouble holding their line. And I think that's what made Toledo such an interesting track. Those back markers, man, they were still going pretty fast. And with those cars being as beat up they were, I mean, back in those days, man, those back marker ARCA cars, they were not as clean, as pristine as you would see here. You know, even Andy Hillenberg's cars look clean and pristine. Back in 2008, you would see an ARCA car back marker show up to the track looking like it had just ran a 500-mile race at Martinsville. They were beat up. So that's just kind of how it was. But it made for very entertaining racing, that is for sure. And then we had the big one of the race. Basically right after each other. We had one big one that had 6 cars in it, which only surprisingly took out 2. Luke Hall and Gabby DiCarlo. Anyone remember Gabby DiCarlo? Anyone remember her? She was the developmental driver for the Doug Stringer team, the 90 of the Great Clips machine. Yeah, neither do I. That triggered a big one. And then just one lap later, we had the huge one for the race, which saw, unfortunately, Michael Simcoe get wrecked by Tom Hezert, going for the lead, might I add, and was unfortunately clipped by Brian Scott, who was then clipped by, Michael was then clipped by the 32, and other cars who had got up into it was the 94 and the 5 again. It was just, for such a small track, the wrecks were huge. And again, it's part of what made that track so entertaining, but it actually started to see like, man, and it's where I saw this part, and it was this part in the race where I saw there were so many cars out of this race. If Scott had kept his cool, man, I still believe Scott had won that championship. But it was for certain at this point that Allgaier had a 40-point lead. He needed to finish 9 spots ahead of Frank Kimmel to guarantee himself the championship. And it looked like nobody was going to stop Justin Allgaier. And, yeah, I mean, he didn't have a winning – spoiler alert, he would win the race, but I don't actually think he had a winning car. It was just kind of right place, right time for Justin. But I don't think he actually had the best car in the field at all. We did actually have some Cup stars in this field, I should side note. David Reagan and Ken Schrader were both in this race. The night before this race was the 2008 Bank of America 500 from Charlotte, where Ken and David didn't have the best race. Ken had crashed early, and he finished multiple laps down, while David Reagan had another one of his average finishes at Roush. So they actually had other people in their cars qualifying and testing for them. Brian Keselowski practiced and qualified to 52, while Brian Tyler practiced and qualified to 39. Schrader, it took a while for Schrader to actually be very, very competitive in the ARCA series on non-dirt tracks. And in 2008, he had about a 5th to 10th place car, but never had the winning car. And I think that was because he ran part-time. He never really put the full funding needed to be there, but would still always come out and be semi-competitive. That 39 team was actually the old Rulo brothers team, and Reagan definitely had a winning car today. And as we're going to talk about in a little bit, it was basically unfortunate circumstances of why David Reagan did not win that ARCA race back in 2008. So we get back from the big one, and by this point, we're only down. By this point, the 99 car had just come back out on track. 2 weeks in a row, the 99 car looks like a pile of junk. Last 2 weeks of the season, those 99 guys really worked their tails off to get that car back out there, but unfortunately just was not meant to be. And a lot of people point at Ricky Stenhouse Jr., you know, his 2 bad years in Xfinity. I believe ARCA really kind of showed that was kind of coming, because Stenhouse overdrove a lot, and I believe that was his biggest problem in his early career, is that he would overdrive the car. But he always seemed to make it work on the bigger tracks, but the smaller tracks is really where Stenhouse would struggle, I felt like. But that's just, again, my personal opinion. So getting later into the race, we had the 0 and the 44 get together. Frank Kimmel did get into some accidents here. Didn't hurt his car at all. By the way, shout out to 00 was actually owned by Brad Keselowski. So that was kind of cool seeing the Brad Keselowski team out there. And how about this? Come full circle, it was a Ford. That 00 team was a Ford. How far have we come 13 years later? And Brad was running a Ford again. So that was kind of funny. The lead had changed quite a few times. By this point, we had Justin Lofton, Justin Allgaier, Frank Kimmel, Brandon Thompson, Tom Hezert, Matt Carter, and David Reagan, who was the current leader at this point, leading laps. But it was the saddest thing ever seeing David, who clearly had, in my opinion, the car to beat. Him and the 20 had made contact on track. But ironically enough, it was not that contact that would hurt him. Just one lap later, David would cut down a right front tire. But the weird part was that the contact of his car would actually come on the left front. So it was really weird how that all happened simultaneously. But unfortunately, the race-winning car, in my opinion, had to pit under green. And then not a lap and a half later, the right front of the 20 would also go down. And both of probably the two best cars in the entire field were not crashed, but done for the day because they were multiple laps down after having to make green flag pit stops. This left Justin Allgaier with the lead again because literally right after those two guys had pitted under green, we had yet another caution for Bobby Gerhardt again, Brian Silas, Ken Schrader, who did get wrecked out in this race, unfortunately, so was not a good weekend for Kenny. And the third Eddie Sharp car, all three of the Eddie Sharp teams had rough days. They did not have the best run. Ken Butler the third was in the 22, if you guys remember him, in the old Aaron's Dream Machine. But yeah, this ARCA race was not a good weekend for Eddie Sharp Racing by any means. The race went green again. And surprisingly, Matt Carter took the lead from Justin Allgaier. And even the announcers were like, is Justin Allgaier just going to kind of ride here, or is he going to try to fight back? Well, it definitely looked like on the restart that the 46 had the better car, but the reason why is he was over driving. He had used up his tires, and within just 4 laps, the 16 had recaught him and passed him and was pulling away as the 46 had really burnt up his stuff and could not even keep the car in the bottom anymore. So what does the 46 do? Now, in fairness, the 20 of Justin Lofton, like I said, had gone 2 laps down. He was trying to get one of his laps back by trying to pass the 46 and going up there to the leader. But we're already under 15 laps to go. I can understand the frustration. He lets the 20 go by, and then the 46 just dumps the 20 in the very next corner like, dude, I'm trying to race for position here. So that was kind of funny. But it left Matt Carter with one more shot. 2 laps to go in the 2008 season, but unfortunately, Allgaier gets a good jump. Carter can't get there. Justin Allgaier wins the race and the championship for 2008. This was by far one of the most chaotic ARCA races I've ever watched, and it's still a reason today why I love this series so much. The final point standings, let's go over the race results first. The chaotic race, which saw of our 35 starters, only 10 finished on the lead lap. And we'll read off our top 10 here. First, Justin Allgaier. Second was Matt Carter. Third was Frank Kimmel. Fourth was future champion Patrick Sheltra. Fifth was Tom Hezert. Sixth was the late John West Townley. Seventh was Brian Silas, back when Andy Hillenberg was actually pretty competitive. Man, I wish he was still these days. I love Andy. We had Taylor Malsom, who was also a Cunningham development driver. And we had a very young Parker Kligerman finishing 9th. And Todd Bowser, who was also running a Taurus, finishing top 10. Those are your top 10 finishers. Wild, chaotic race. Definitely, if you're an ARCA fan, my review does not do it justice. The race itself, the broadcast is actually only about an hour and 40 minutes long. It's on YouTube. The whole thing's on YouTube. Go and watch it. I'd love to do a watch along, but I don't want to get copyrighted. Someday I might do it anyway, because we might be able to work out the copyright stuff by then. But if you have time, go and watch this race. It's so entertaining. It's so funny at the same time. And if you love the classic Gen 4 racing short track style, this is the race for you, absolutely. Our final championship standings were Justin Allgaier by 50 points, beat Frank Kimmel. Matt Carter had actually scored enough points to move up to third, while Ricky Stenhouse Jr. and Scott Speed dropped all the way to fourth and fifth. Scott Speed coming in first, leaving in fifth, after overall really having one of the best seasons. But in terms of consistency and wins, Justin Allgaier actually had the best season. And sixth was Patrick Sheltra. Seventh was John West Townley. Eighth was Tom Hezert. Ninth was Taylor Malsom. And in 10th in points was Ken Butler III. In case you're wondering where our backmarker buddies were, Daryl Bash ended up 15th in points. Brad Smith ended up 17th, and Norm Benning ended up 19th, in case you guys were wondering. I love those guys. But anyway, also chaotic ARCA race. Again, I can't say again, go out and watch it. My review doesn't do it justice. As for the classic racing reviews, I just thought this would be a fun idea to come back and review two of the most chaotic ARCA races, or one of the most chaotic conclusions to an ARCA season that I think will never be topped. And I thought this would be fun to review for your guys. I don't know if we're going to do any reviews in the future. We might. Just going to try to plan some things down. I did post on Twitter a couple of days ago, or even yesterday, I think, that I have some big plans coming up for 2022. I still can't share those with you guys yet, but stick with me here on the channel. Don't know if there's going to be even a podcast next week, but we'll still work some things out. I still hope you guys will join me. I hope you guys still enjoy your Wednesday night, and we'll see you guys next time. You guys know the drill. So long, guys.